Hello, story seekers. I'm Nico.
I'm Ben, and welcome to the Tiny Bookcases Novella Writing Month miniseries.
February is the shortest month, so we decided to write something longer than usual in it.
We're also, quite crucially, writing the novella together, a first as we've not written something substantial with each other before.
Last week, you heard the first part of chapter 1, and then we discussed our approach to working on the middle of the book.
This week, we're here to read another excerpt and discuss how the novella writing month went.
And let's jump straight in with that excerpt. Ben, hit it.
The ungainly size of the trolls was their disadvantage. With a practiced sweep, Rumble rushed to meet them, swinging the axe in a low arc. It caught one of the grey-fleshed monsters below its mockery of a knee and took it apart. The sharpness of their father's axe, immune to the corrosion of time and impacts, parted the reeking meat like an oar slices through a lake's surface. There was scant time to enjoy the blow, and, knowing that soon Glint would call for the axe, Rumble continued his gory work. He smoothly swung the axe backwards, and the butt, which had so recently performed its sacred duty, crashed into the head of the next troll. Its face bones were shattered in the crushing impact, and one of its eyes was knocked from its head. Another troll, scrambling over a pile of schist, caught it from the air and greedily devoured it. Eye jelly ran over its exposed fangs as it munched.
Rumble! Axe!
Glint's timing was impeccable. Rumble glanced away from the oncoming foe and saw his brother dangerously embroiled. He had seized the nose of his nearest attacker as it lunged for him. Two thick fingers had split the thing's nostrils, and, with manic, twisting motions, Glint was using its spasming shape to fend off two more that had reached him. More were coming.
Coming!
Rumble took a step, pulled his arm back, then cast the axe at one of the trolls that sought to find a gap in Glint's defence. The deadly missile sang a whirring note as it flew, razor sharp and heavy as a grown dwarf. It struck the troll in the chest, shattering its ribcage and gouging the organs beneath. The beast seemed paralysed and rocked back and forth as its eyes glazed over. Glint flung the big troll he had been puppeteering to the rock-strewn floor and quickly snatched the axe back from Rumble's kill. Another large grey shape slammed into him, bowling him over. Glint managed to roll, rocks digging into his unarmoured back, and brought the axe up in time to block the slashing claws of his assailant. The troll's tongue lolled out like a belt strap, the pointed tip of it seeking to taste his face. Glint brought the haft up with a vicious shove, knocking the troll sideways with the end, and then he rocked back the opposite way, dragging the bevel of the axe's blade across the beast's throat. It collapsed behind him as he rushed to his feet. The troll with the split nostrils rose unsteadily before him in a shaft of sunlight. Foul-smelling ichor poured from its ruin of a nose. Glint twisted on the spot, and, allowing the axe to slide within his grip so that he grasped the heel, he hacked at the troll with a spinning chop. The blow decapitated the beast with a sound like silk whispering over metal. Glint sang the next note of their song, elated. He felt alive with cunning violence, and danced a bloody jig when more of them howled from the gloom to join him in that pool of daylight.
A hunt!
Rumble had found himself embroiled in a grapple. The troll was not so strong, but was tall and making use of it.
Brother!
Glint frowned, knowing the death he could deal if he retained the weapon, but with a jerking throw released the axe in a high arc towards his twin. Rumble saw it and quickly dropped to a squat, dragging the troll off balance, before exploding upwards again. The top of his head pulped the thing's jaw. It reeled away, fangs jutting through the flesh under its chin. Rumble, his hands abruptly free, caught the axe. He spun it in his hand and then raised it to confirm the abomination's death. The three corpses Glint had made in the pool of light made footing treacherous. Without the axe to balance him, he wobbled through attempts to parry the attacks from the remaining trolls. Each of them scratched and beat at him from the gloom in a frenzy of hunger. When he finally slipped on the ichor-slick belly of a dead troll, the two of them that remained were on him in an instant. Eager maws were thrust towards him, seeking to snatch bites of his flesh until he was nothing but butchered parts. Glint collapsed under their combined weight, but managed to seize both by their throats as he fell, each of his massive hands holding them back so that their fangs gnashed just shy of his face. He flexed the huge, mine-built muscles of his backs and arms. Inexorably, their faces began to turn until the two trolls could only see each other. When he pushed them closer still, each began to rabidly attack and eat the other's face. One of them won, unhinging its jaw and swallowing the head of its victim. The thing grinned as, with its belly momentarily full, it grew larger. Strips of cheek gristle hung like ghastly decorations from its fangs. It turned implacably against Glint's strength to look down at him. Its muscles bunched, and he winced as it stabbed him in the sides with its claws. But Glint could not afford to lose his grip on its throat. He added his other hand to his grip and violently shook the troll, seeking to close its windpipe. The jagged claws began to drag through his clothes and the skin of his sides. The troll's questing hands were slowly unseaming him from ribs to hips. Glint felt his eyes bulge from the pain and watched as the wounds on the troll's face began to rapidly seal, leaving knotted scar tissue where they had been moments ago. He knew in that moment that it had him. Something changed in the dormant forge around them, which to Glint seemed to be alive again with heat and sound. He imagined the bellows pumping and the hissing spit of quenched steel. Light, eclipsing the sun's rays, cast the troll in warped green luminescence. He heard his brother's stamping boots thundering towards him and smelled the acrid forge fire which had ignited on their father's axe blade. Rumble struck the big troll in its belly with a mighty upward strike. Green flames flickered over its gnarled flesh for a moment before the axe burst through. The cauterized halves of it fell away from Glint, who lay panting and clutching his sides as they finished their chant together. With a sound like a subterranean stream through a rock wall, the sacred dwarven magic consumed the meat of the trolls, spreading from corpse to corpse within the abandoned forge. The brothers squinted their eyes, avoiding the damage the fire could do to their sight, and in moments the trolls were reduced to ash. The abandoned forge was filled with the sounds of their ragged breathing. Rumble extinguished his forge fire, summoning a smile of relief.
Close.
Rumble helped Glint up off the ash-strewn ground and embraced him.
Never in doubt.
Glint grimaced. He looked again at the light of day above them, wondering what life could be like out there.
So there we have it, the second part of chapter 1, which means if you've been following, you've had the prologue in chapter 1, and you have to wait for the rest. Haha, sucks to be you.
Yeah, it's a bit odd on its own, that piece, isn't it? Because it's something that the first half was building towards, and then it's just a big fucking fight.
That was technically in media res, I believe.
It just jumped straight in. The ungainly size of the trolls was their disadvantage. What now, there's trolls? Yeah.
Well,
but
mate, let's delete the first part. Let's just go straight in like that.
Yeah. There's some stuff in there that I really like, though. Like, obviously, I like it all, but the forge fire is a really interesting bit of world building that I find interesting. We wanted to capture this idea that there is magic in this world, but it comes from heightened emotional states, I think, and in particular, just for the dwarves, I think, so far.
I think I really like it just because they're so intense as a people that the idea of that intensity actually verges on the supernatural. That's such a fun little thing.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, there must be other shows where I guess the Force is very emotional, isn't it? But
I've never seen it. Is Dragon Ball Z a bit like that?
That's mostly about like your chi energy or your ki energy.
Oh, fair enough. The only exposure I've had to Dragon Ball Z was watching the shitty live action movie for our previous project, which was called Reel to Reels for the diehards out there, which was where Nico and I did. We alternated in, reviewing the best and worst movies of all time, and that was sort of the first time we started doing stuff together. It's nice to think about that, but
it was.
I was forced to watch some truly atrocious movies, much to your delight.
but there were movies on there so bad that I couldn't enjoy them because
Yeah.
I had to watch the Bratz movie, which was it's burned into my heart as a mistake I can never undo. Oh, it's the fact that
Yeah.
these movies got made. That anyway, that's a story for another time, I think.
Mm. But what else? So there's this idea that the trolls, when they eat, they heal and get bigger.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Yeah, I like it a lot
Love
too.
that.
And obviously, in the first half that we read last week, you see that there's this big arm comes through. So it all ties in. There's this idea that there's probably like a giant, colossal troll outside missing an arm. Is implied quite heavily, I think.
Yeah, I mean it does reach in, flip them off, and explode.
Yep.
It's because of the implication.
Because of the implication. And then also there's this idea that I know that you were in love with from the start, and I really caught my attention when we started writing the two characters.
Yeah,
But the idea of there's only one axe, that they're twins, which I
yeah,
suspect we're going to have to make rare amongst the dwarves to make this a problem.
yes,
Um, and there's only one axe to inherit, and they haven't managed to crack the orb, the the orb of stone geode, to find out which one of them is up. Um, so they just have to share the axe, and in doing so, have to throw it back and forth whilst they are fighting for their lives.
yeah.
Um,
I
yeah,
think there's something so, I guess, charming's the word about that idea. That you
yeah.
could just buy another one, but no, it's the principle of the thing.
It's got
Like
a
it
lot of that
killed.
energy of like fighting back to back in heroic
Yeah.
action movies. Um, when I said heroic action movies, I was trying to think of a more sort of fantastical example, but the only one that jumped into my head was Rush Hour.
That's my favorite fantasy film.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
now we're going to work in Rumble saying, I don't want no trouble, aren't we? That's.
obviously. Um, if
Oh,
it,
okay.
big rumble in Little Mountain.
Listeners, if I don't manage to sneak in the dwarves speaking to humans at some point, and Glint saying, "Do you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth?" and Rumble responding, "Nobody understands the words that are coming out of your mouth," then I have failed.
I feel like we might get sued by Brett Ratner if he's. Is that even his name? You know, the guy that got completely cancelled. That was the the big producer behind the Rush Hour movies and a few other things.
As much as I love those movies, it's not hard to see why the person behind them might get cancelled, is it?
Yeah, a little bit. Anyway, pretty happy with that. I think just on that performance, I think potentially there's a bit more work to be done to smooth that out. Maybe it could even be done by sort of elongating it a little bit. There's lots of action. You know, there's not a huge amount of rise and fall in that.
Yeah,
But that does make sense because it's very, very intense, that moment. It's just, I think, just reading it on its own, it sounds almost like it might be too much. But I think, as in the context of the rest of the chapter, I think it's fine. I think it's
yeah.
fine.
I think it does need that slow build of the first part, that
Mm,
calm before the storm, to make sense in a way.
definitely, yeah, because it was conceived as one thing, wasn't it? That idea for that chapter, that it was this sort of
Yeah,
the quiet tension of this sort of reverent moment that fails and then gets rudely interrupted and turned into helter skelter, fight for your life.
yeah.
Um, yeah, we
I think
go on.
I was gonna say it is interesting that's one of the first examples that I can see really of where actually planning it made a difference, because that first chapter could have ended with and then the ceiling caved in, but knowing where we wanted the story to be in chapter 2, for example,
Yeah,
meant that we're like, no, that we have to get to this, so how do we get there and keep it interesting? And I think without having had the structure that we put in, I probably wouldn't have written the chapter in that way. So it is interesting to see it having an effect, nearly immediately
Yeah.
in what we've produced.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, I completely agree. I think we both benefited from a bit more of a structured approach, and
Yeah,
I've definitely learnt stuff during this month that I did not know before.
yeah,
Not only from working with you, but also from approaching the particular challenges, shall we say, of writing a novella.
hmm.
But with that in mind, like this is the last episode that we're going to do on this, at least for the time being, and we need to talk about what we want from how we intend to end it. I think a story's only
Yeah,
as good as its ending. It's so easy to fluff an ending. Um, what would you like from an ending? I know we've already written parts of it, but
yeah.
like,
It's
what's your favorite kind of ending? Is probably the best way of putting that.
it's it's really difficult because I do like a little bit of saccharine in my ending. I want to feel like something good happened to the people that deserved something good.
Okay.
But from experience, I think that's so much more powerful when it's. I think tainted might be the right word, but in a book like in the Fifth Elephant,
Bittersweet, maybe.
yeah.
Yeah.
But in the Fifth Elephant by Pratchett, at the end, uh, Captain Carrot and Angua decide they're gonna take some time for themselves, and Vimes does the same with Lady Sybil. We're gonna take our time going back. But while Vimes is finally getting to relax, Carrot and Angua are dealing with grief and how complicated their relationship is. But
Mm.
it is under that kind of lens of love and doing what we have to make things work. So I think if there's what if there's a positive outcome, and we're quite lucky here in having written this as twins, because if one of them is like, okay, I understand my place now and what I'm doing and what I want, for the other one to be still in reckoning with something, I think that's where I want the story to be. Because I don't think it doesn't feel like this is a story that fits just in one novella. I think this story does, but the world and the characters I think are too big already in my head and my heart for just this amount of words.
Mm.
So it has to be something that feels like not, oh, it's not done, you're gonna have to get the next one, but
Mm-hmm.
conceivably these characters will go on living and they will deal with the things they've learned, and maybe one day we'll get to see that story.
I like that a lot. I think that's I think we're on the same page there. This idea of having um, the obviously the plot and the story have advanced hugely, but character is key. Character is king, really.
Yeah,
And in order for you can't just have fight the big bad, end the story. I think it needs to mean something. It needs to. Hopefully, by the time that people have finished reading it, they will have connected to some, if not most, of the characters.
yeah,
And my favorite thing is to just look back and see how far they've come and how much they've changed and how much maybe they've changed me as well in
yeah.
in reading it and writing it, whatever. So yeah, no, I think we're on the same page there. It all sounds very lovey-dovey and earnest there, doesn't it? But there is a huge amount of violence in this book, so stay tuned for that, I
A
guess.
lot.
But
The but I think it is important to see, like, Sam Gamgee's return to the Shire is a great example of
yes,
he goes back and he gets the life he wanted, but
that's
it's
a
not the same
really
Hobbit
yeah,
that left.
that's a really
Yeah,
good example. It's almost like he was the right size for the Shire when he leaves, but by the time he comes back, he's sort of outgrown it, hasn't he? He's become worldly. He's faced great peril. He's come through it. He's resilient. He's stronger than he ever was before. And you see it in the not in the epilogue in the sort of roundup, don't you? At the end, where
yeah.
it turns out that he becomes like king of the Shire for 30 years or
He's
something.
he's the mayor for ages, and I think one of the best parts of that story is his reckoning with mortality, because he could have gone into the West, and it's like, no, this is my home. It was always my home. We did that thing, and it sucked, but now I have a family and I've made a life, and like what a character. Like,
Yeah,
so I mean that's the kind of character you want to be able to write, isn't it? When you're doing
absolutely.
anything.
Yeah,
But
absolutely. So, just talking about writing characters and stuff, how do we think that finding half a character's voice differed from finding the character on our own in our own writing?
it's definitely more complicated, isn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
The like often when I'm writing dialogue on my own, like I've said before on the podcast, I'll say it out loud. But I tend to write conversations quite rapid fire, and then I'll go back and I'll say, "Was that right?" But here, I'm stopping and think, would they say that? And there's a lot more process because it's
Consideration,
not
yeah.
just not just my character, and it's looking at what else they've done. And sometimes I'll read something you've written and you make a decision for them, and I'm like, yeah, that's absolutely right, and now I know more about that character,
Mm.
and it will inform what I do, and then hopefully you get the same thing. Yeah, of course he
Yeah,
reacted like
absolutely.
that. And I think it was really difficult at first, but as it's gone on and more has happened, and we're getting familiar with the characters in a way that's kind of like reading someone else's book, because you read the character and you're like, oh, now I know something about them I didn't before. It's
Yes.
it's like verging on fan fiction, but in your own work, because you're sharing that character and their decisions and their words with someone else, and it's definitely been it's got easier as it's gone on. That's what I take as my big takeaway from it.
I'd agree. I'd agree. I think there's one character in particular that stands out that we've only had a small bit from. I think he's in the prologue, isn't he? Murmur,
Yes.
and that was the only one where I was pretty much instantly. I was like, this is the pattern for how this person speaks.
Yeah.
Because he's sort of playing around with. He occasionally refers to himself in the third person, and that because it's kind of odd and it sort of doesn't look right on paper in a way.
Yeah.
It had to be consistent from the start
Yes.
in order for that character to make sense. And I think that was a big one. I think because there were a couple, especially later on. I think there was a scene that you'd written with him in, and you had perfectly taken the conversation exactly where it should have gone with the sort of travails that it would have gone through. But I was going through just sort of making it fit the grammar of that character, and
Yeah.
it felt quite technical in a way. That particular moment didn't feel particularly creative for me, but it still felt very rewarding. Like I was scratching an itch, like just ironing that dialogue for that particular character. It was
I
very
think
pleasing.
that's particularly fascinating because that character is like a personification of this project, because he is two voices stuck in one dwarf.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought about
So
that.
it's actually it's kind of an interesting that it takes both of us to get his voice just right.
Yeah.
I think that's quite a good little analogy. The
Yeah, it's been a hell of a time this month, hasn't it?
yeah.
Just because we sort of took on this reasonably large project, and both of us have gotten incredibly busy during this month at various different points. But through it all, the main thing that we've had, which has been incredibly positive for me, and I think it has been for you as well, just how easy it has been just to reach out and say, "This is I'm into this. Here's an idea. What do you think?" And
Yeah.
it can, there was one that I had one when I was drifting off to sleep the other day, and I sent you a message with it. Um, and it's just being able to have those conversations with somebody else is a really
Yeah.
pleasant bit of the process. Because normally what would happen there is I would write something like that in my drill book, and I'd be sort of puzzling it out for myself.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, it works very nicely. It works very nicely.
There's the two options as well. There's you write it down and you think about it for a while and you write something else down. Or I have the other option, and I'm sure you do this, not with my wife, but with your own partner, where you tell them the brilliant idea you've had for the thing you're writing, and they go, "Yeah, that sounds cool," because they have none of the context,
No
so they
context.
don't really know what it means. And while
Well,
they are interested, they're not in this unfinished world with you. So that's been nice to have someone in there, sort of putting the scaffold up.
in the trenches with you. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I mentioned this multiple times inside the first year or so of the podcast, but for a very long time, and I'm still sort of worried about it in a sort of almost like a phobic kind of way. For a very
Mm.
long time, if I told a story idea to somebody, so if I verbalized it to somebody
Yeah.
and they liked it and they got on board with it, there was a part of my brain that just sort of went, job done.
Oh,
And
okay.
and then if I hadn't written it down or anything like that, it was very difficult to re-find it after that, because it was sort of like, one of the things that we're doing as writers is trying to connect with your audience. And if you're talking to somebody that you value the opinion of, you tell them an idea and they say that's a good idea. There's just something in there that just sort of, for me anyway, initially, that sort of made that the sort of stopping point.
Yeah.
And that was for years and years that was happening to me, because I've wanted to write and be a writer for most of my life since I was a kid. Um, got a bit distracted with like a full time job that was more like uh, two jobs smashed together in my sort of 20s, and then yeah, and here we are. So I feel like I've pushed through that now, and the ultimate expression of that has been us being able to just talk about a story, and
Yeah.
afterwards I'm still really excited to go and write it. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
even more so, in fact.
I think that's lovely because it is easy to get the serotonin hit from saying an idea you've had to someone and them going, "That is a good idea," and you're like, "Yes, it is. I was right. Excellent." But then finding pleasure in the process of expanding that idea and turning it into something, I think that it's a part of growing up is in that of the kind of, oh wait, it was nice when one person said that's a good idea, but what if I put it in a book and then like thousands of people told me it was a good idea? Oh, then I'd have achieved what I want with my life. Maybe I should just do that.
Yep.
Who knew, Ben? Who knew?
Who knew? Who knew? No, there's some very stupid things can happen inside my head sometimes. It's mostly to do with psychology. Um,
Speaking of those thousands of people, by the way, do you
yeah,
think do you think you've nailed down who the target audience is outside of people who listen to the Tiny Bookcase?
for the novella, I think
Yeah,
it's yeah, okay. I think it's anyone who, well, for a start, reads fantasy. I think that's a big one.
yeah,
Um, I think it's got a lot of stuff to do with identity and your
yeah,
place in the world. And because of that, I think it then broadens out a bit, and you end up with probably a mature audience. I think it's definitely not a YA thing.
no,
I don't think it's exclusionary though. I was reading adult fantasy books when I was sort of 12, 13, as I'm sure were you. So I think people in that bracket would be well served by reading this.
yeah.
Um,
I'd say not YA through dint of being inaccessible for younger people, but
yeah,
more because it doesn't fit the themes that generally go into YA.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I don't think there's any particular like gender, or as I've said, like I think it's a pretty broad age bracket. I think it's fantasy readers, but I think it's also quite accessible for people that are aware of fantasy on the fringe and aren't.
Yeah,
There are deep cuts in there, but it's not a complex. You have to be extremely well read on all the best fantasy to read this. I think we've deliberately kept it um, quite accessible in that regard.
yeah,
Go on, what do you think?
yeah. I definitely agree, especially in that because we've tried to make we've kept the dwarf things that if you said to someone what is a dwarf in the fantasy genre, they'd go short beard axe. Okay, cool. And then everything else we've tried to make our own, and it means
Mm,
that you don't need to have that dearth of knowledge. Like if you've got the basics, you're going to be fine. You can already picture them in your head. Just enjoy it. I'd like to think
mm,
it's because there has historically there's been uh, lots of people, especially around fantasy and sci-fi, who are quite exclusionary, especially in terms of gender, and I can't really speak for how it's been in terms of sexuality, but I think the book is, for myself, and definitely how it reads from the things you write, it just tries to be honest about the experience, not the human experience, because they're dwarves. But I think anyone who's it's for anyone who's ever had to really think about, am I doing the thing I actually want to do? I think it's a
Yeah.
finding yourself book,
Yes,
and
definitely.
just under it's got a cloak with "I am a fantasy book" written on it. But I think in a way that's why it's good for YA, because it's responsibility versus that wanderlust, that lust for life, that
Passions, yeah.
finding the
Yeah.
balance, yeah, finding the balance of who you're supposed to be and who you want to be. It's yeah, it's a really difficult one, isn't it, saying who's your audience? Because like
Mm.
I would never want to be like, I'm writing this for neurodivergent women, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably not the right writer without more research and help from someone to do that. But I'd also like to think anything I write would be accessible for all of the categories that covers.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's a difficult question, that isn't it? Really, because essentially you do need to know who you're writing for,
Yeah,
because otherwise you can't tailor it. And I think we sort of try to express what that angle of things. Who have we been producing it for? That's that.
yeah,
But then there's also another meaning for audience, which is a more of a marketing term, which I don't know. I think we've potentially got less experience with. I'm sure it would be possible to break it down into demographics and all the rest of it, but I don't think we can from our current vantage point, or should.
no.
So yeah,
That's hopefully someone with a fancy office who knows about this stuff will do that for us. That would be lovely.
yeah.
If you're listening from a fancy office, hi, drop us an email.
That being said, though, I'm really pleased. One of the things that I like about this is that it's come from the bookcase. It's going back to the bookcase, and it's going out for free. And if it went through any kind of publisher or anything like that, that wouldn't be possible.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, I'm pretty pleased with our approach to it, and I'm really excited to see what happens next with it. As we continue to add to it, continue to polish it. Um, at what point are we both going to know it's done?
yeah, that's
It's
a big one.
it's oh, am I going to reach that point before you? Is it going to get awkward at that point? Or vice versa. At that point, it might be quite interesting to have that conversation on mic, because unless we unanimously decide it's done, it could be
Yeah,
interesting to see what happens at that tail end of that process, because that's a very personal moment, that isn't it?
yeah. It's. I mean, one of us says, "I think it's done." No, I'm not. I'm not sure. Makes an edit. Well, now it's not done, is it? Because you changed it. Oh no, I do believe that we have a degree of simpatico, or simpatica rather, which means that we will generally, how I think this will go is I will say, I think it's done. Is it done? And you'll say, no. And then we'll try a bit more, and I'll say, now I think it's done. And you'll go, probably. And it will never be a yes from either of us all the way. Because if everything I've learned from the authors we've had on is true, it's never really done. It's just done enough.
Done enough. I know we discussed the idea of going on a almost like a writers' retreat together, and just sort of locking
Yeah.
ourselves away to do that like last bit, or to write the next thing. So that could be interesting as well. We'll have to see where that goes. Bit down the line, because we'll be returning to normal episodes. Before we move on from like at what point is it done? Do you mind if I quote June?
I don't mind that at all.
Arrakis teaches the attitude of the knife, chopping off what's incomplete and saying, "Now it's complete because it's ended here." And that's a quote from June, and it's from the collected sayings of Muad'Dib by the Princess Irulan. And I feel like that may have been Frank Herbert just being like, "Yeah, I finished the fucking book." The Fremen are the
the
best editors.
irony, the irony of that being in the first of the Dune books, then seeing how much more Dune we got is really funny.
Well, I mean, obviously he wrote a fair few of them, but his son actually
Yes,
quite a lot as well. So
his
yeah,
gift.
multiple depths to that irony. So final question, I think: ambition
Okay.
versus expectation. How does building a world for a novella differ from shorter things, longer things, or even from flash fiction?
I think you have to do a lot more legwork than you do for a short story. We've spoken quite a lot about how actually good short story writing lets you leave a load of space for people to do the hard part, where you're like, okay, I know what this is, and I let the words that are missing tell the story that I don't have the time and space to tell.
Yeah, and although sometimes it is a bit more like a haiku, isn't it? Where it's everything is
Yeah,
laden with meaning because you've built up this simpatico with your reader to the point where they can fill in the gaps. So
yeah.
I think I think that might be because you're good at it that you think that's the easy way.
Okay, fair enough.
I think a lot of people struggle with that, and but I do fully agree that there is a lot more legwork in this because you have to, we've essentially done the world building for a novel series
Yeah.
in order to write a novella. And that's quite tricky because we then need to make sure that it doesn't feel like too much for this one book.
Yeah.
Again, that idea of the pacing has to be right. And yeah,
I,
and fully, we need to make sure that as much of that good stuff does go in without it feeling overloaded. So
yeah.
tricky. It is like a short story on a much bigger scale rather than being like
Yes.
writing a novel.
I think this has been one of the benefits of co-writing is that instead of saying, okay, there are elves and they do this, the way we've been able to approach world building is to say, there are elves. Do they do this?
Mm.
Oh, yeah, maybe they do. Why do they do that? Oh, is it because of this? Yes, it is. And I think in that way, it's been quite different because it means we have this dearth of stuff that we can pull from. And I think then, whereas in a novel, you'd use all of it. And you'd go, well, that I need that for there. I need that for there. There are concepts that we've written down about our dwarves in this world, for example, that are so cool that probably won't come up in this novella, but there is no way that it's being abandoned forever. Because if we write about more dwarves in this world, or even more humans, more elves, more whatever, there will be an opportunity for that thing.
Mm.
And I think having it's like making those like endless soups they have in some
Yeah,
Asian countries.
like a gumbo.
And you're like, oh, okay, yeah, we've got this giant endless soup, and here's a bowl of it, and then everything else goes in the soup, and then we'll have another bowl later.
You add some more water, you add some more ingredients, and then it's the same soup tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's been interesting, and I think it's because I normally only write short stories or things with jokes in. I don't have to send the roots out too far. And
Hmm.
to have it all written down like we have, that's been very different for me. To have a reference document and go, oh, what we said something about why they behave like this, or why they have songs, or why they wear their hair in this way, and it means you can look and go, oh yeah, okay. Well, actually, I think that will influence X thing, and in a way, rather than like when I write short stories, I feel like the words influence the world. Here, the world is influencing the words.
Yes. The tone is coming from the world building, isn't it?
Yeah,
And that world building was an intensely uh, well co-writing experience. Basically, we we really put our heads together on every single element of world building and knocked it around properly. Writers roomed it, and then when we started writing, the tone was just sort of ready there, wasn't it?
yeah,
It was just sort of ready to be plucked. Um, and whilst we have still had to find a lot of stuff as we've been writing, it's felt pretty cohesive. At least after that first week, I think it's felt pretty. Sorry, that was something fell over my desk. It's felt pretty cohesive. Yeah. Well, it's the end of the month. In fact, by the time this comes out, February will have ended, and the novella is not finished. But that's because it feels like it's a worthy project, I think, and we're going to really go for it. We could have smashed out, like we did during the NaNoWriMos, just smashed out 40,000 words between the two of us. Like, that wouldn't have been a problem at all. But the thing that we learned from doing the NaNoWriMo was that that's, whilst it's a good way of like unblocking yourself maybe and just sort of saying that yes, you can write that amount of words, it's really not the best way for either of us to actually write a novel. I'm still editing that novel because it was such a fucking mess after I finished it in NaNoWriMo. And we've had loads and loads of authors come on and be like, how, different levels of intensity in the edits and stuff. And yeah, so this approach of taking our time with it, doing it right, and maybe having a bit less to do on the back end, I think is the right way for us to do it, especially as a co-writing venture.
Yeah, I think as soon as we started to really, like, we always cared about the words, but when they started to feel like our words and we wanted them to look right, I knew it wasn't going to be end of the month, cut the tail off, there it is. It's like, no.
Yeah.
As soon as it was like, no, we're going to do this fucking right, I was like, well, see you in May, I guess.
Yeah. So going forwards, we'll be sure to keep everybody updated on the novella. You might hear snippets of what we're doing in and around episodes. But next week we'll be back to normal programming, really. So you can join us for an absolutely wonderful interview with Stephen Ariane. And I think I can probably speak for us both here, but we had an absolutely phenomenal time talking with Stephen. So
Hot time.
Really do tune in for that and listen to it because he's a phenomenal writer and a really good guest. So yeah.
And if you want to help support the podcast at the moment, if you pop onto YouTube and look for The Tiny Bookcase, a subscribe does a whole load for us, and you can stick us on in the background and listen to everything that's come out up to now, including this one. Listen again. Why not?
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Tiny Bookcase.
Remember to subscribe, otherwise you're going to miss out on the future fun.
Also, tell a friend. If you like this episode, link them to it.
We'd be tremendously grateful. You can follow us on Twitter at BookcaseTiny, Facebook at The Tiny Bookcase, and Instagram at BookcaseTiny for updates. Speaking of supporting the podcast, well, magic can only take one so far. The Tiny Bookcase is supported by the generosity of its patrons. Those kind souls have really kept my belly full the last year. Let's cast a spell for them, shall we? For rich ginger tones on their scalp, let us cast the Orangi Hedondo spell for Scott Byrne, and for general fabulousness, why not the Ooh La La How's Your Mother spell on Matthew McLaren?
How do you come up with that shit, man?